sit on the border places, go to the center to allow persons who will be late to sit calmly. You understand me, yes? So I'm happy to meet you again, though it is the last lecture in this cycle, and that's why, of course, I'm a little bit grim, because it's a pleasure for me to meet all of you each Wednesday evening. It's the main event for my Wednesday and maybe even for all my week to meet with you. So this is the last lecture, and in some way it is, for me, it's very important. Since we ought not only to understand the plot of the Bolsheviks regime, we did so on the previous lecture, and you remember very well that I tried to explain you that it's necessary for us not to follow these ideological mystifications which Bolsheviks used, Sovietsky, so councils, communist ideology, and we ought to see the plot of regime. And the plot of regime is a criminal gang with no ideology. It's impossible to suppose that, for example, Stalin was pure communist with some idealistic ideas about prosperity of the people. It's very naive to think so. And you remember that in not once Lenin said that those Western people who believe in their communist ideas and support, because of communist ideas, communist regime in Russia, they're useful idiots. Useful idiots. And it is, he not very often say truth, but these words are truth. So we understand that this regime was a gang, criminal gang, and Gorbachev, who never had this experience, who was maybe the first communist leader who really accepts this socialist ideology, he and his wife, Raisa Maximovna, were the people who believe in these things, really, not Khrushchev, no Brezhnev, neither Khrushchev nor Brezhnev believed, but Gorbachev believed. He was very, in this way, maybe he was a practical politician, but in this way he was a rather naive person. He believed, and I knew him very well and met him many times after his resignation, and we had private conversations, and I saw from these conversations that he really believed in these socialist ideas. He was the first real socialist among Bolsheviks leaders of Russia. But when he resigned on the very significant day, it was a day of Christmas. You remember that Gorbachev resigned on the 25th of December 1991. When he resigned, Soviet Union collapsed, and a new organization was established. It was a Commonwealth of independent states, former Soviet republics. Republics also is, of course, fails word, but we use it to use some words. These ideas of Gorbachev of pure socialism, of course, finished in nothing. Because it was impossible to build in this poor state, which was possessed by gang of bandits for 7 decades, more than 7 decades, it was impossible to build in a moment, or maybe in 5 years, a prosperous socialist state, just as we see, for example, in Denmark or in Sweden. It's impossible. It was impossible. Gorbachev did not understand this, I think. But his successor in Russia, Mr. Yeltsin, understood it maybe better. But he believed to his advisors. You remember that the main economical advisor of Gorbachev was Yavlinsky, Grigory Yavlinsky, now the leader of Yabloko. For Yeltsin, his advisors were, the main advisor was Gaidal, Yegor Gaidal, George Gaidal, and Anatoly Chubais. These young also believe, these two persons also believe in Marx's ideas, but believe in opposite sense. They understood that it is necessary to build anti-Marxist state in Russia to improve situation in Russia. But they suppose that market has the main significance, and so if market economy were introduced in Russia, everything would be perfect in a very short period of time. And they explained this idea to Mr. Yeltsin, who for sure was not strong in economics, but believed to these young people with some connections in the Western world among colleagues. And he agreed to this very serious experiment. To organize market and to turn common property of the state, and almost all property was property of the state, in reality the property of this small group of bandits who possessed Russia, because they did with this property what they like, and who used property in its interest, this person possessed it. So they decided to turn this property, which was confiscated from millions of Russian people 50 years ago, in 1930, he decided to make this property again private. And this was the first and great mistake. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin believed in democracy in itself. That democracy in itself will improve everything, and market economy will improve economic situation of the state. But the main thing for both these regimes, for Gorbachev rule and for Yeltsin rule, is that both of them did not understand that the property of the state was illegal property. That this property belonged to the successors of many simple people from whom it was confiscated in the beginning of the communist rule. And they didn't think that it's necessary to return it. Nobody think about this. The property was not returned, land property, for example. But this property was distributed among persons who were most active and who were close to the center of power, because distribution of property was again in the hands of these small group of people. Among them, Yeltsin was the first. So, in 2 years, from 1992 to 1994, almost all property of the country, and it was tremendous amounts of property. Russia was a rich country with great minings, with oil production, with forests, with many minerals, and of course with many plants and factories. All this was distributed among very small couple of people. Almost 1, maybe 2% of population in Russia received all property which can produce some benefit, it can produce some income. And these 1-2% of people, population of people turned to be extremely rich in one moment, not because they great knowledge in economics, as Henry Ford, for example, but simply because they are closest to the center of power. Nothing else. The problem is that majority of the people fail to understand that they are robbed again. Almost everybody forgot in this 1991, 1992, that they were owners of property. The situation in Russia was different to the situation, for example, in Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, almost everybody remember that his parents, maybe themselves, if they were old people, they remember himself, were owners of something. Plot of land, some house in the town or city, some factory, small factory, large factory. In Russia, everybody forgot about it. Almost everybody forgot about it. Because 7 decades of communist propaganda changed brains, changed consciousness of the people. To be owner mean in Russia, in communist time, something very bad. To have no property is something very good. It's a paradox, but propaganda used these forms, false forms, because leaders of the country had everything. They had everything and their life was wonderful. But simple people fail to say, return us our property, return us property of our parents and grandparents. Almost nobody said about this. But people see themselves poor, even much more poor than they were during the communist regime where some social guarantees worked. Of course, not because communists were so humanistic-minded people, but because it was necessary to support population for having good army, for having good industry, etc. Even for slaves, it's necessary to give some medical assistance if you need in these slaves, if you need to use them. That's why these social guarantees were in during this communist Bolsheviks period. And people think not to return property, but to return these social guarantees, to return to this organized world of communist past. The majority supposed that at that time, during the communist past, life was much more better, much more protected, much had good guarantees, and it was not necessary to think about future. But now they see that somebody, they couldn't fail to understand how, but somebody turned to be very rich, and they continue to be poor, even more poor than before. It is not only the problem of ownership. It was also a problem of democracy. Because if property is distributed in such an unequal way, no democratic forms can be used. Why? It's very easy to explain. In democratic state, immediately would emerge a political party, and even, maybe even not one, which say, state is organized on the fails way. The property is in the hands of people who had no rights to it. Let's return to some more equal form. And different political parties would give their projects how to improve situation. Something like this was in Russia in 1993 and in the beginning of 1994, and even was resulted in political conflict, political disorder, and you remember this attempt of coup d'etat in 1993 October. Communists and communist-minded people say, let's return to common property. Let's return to the Soviet realities. Yavlinsky and his party gave another decision. Let us give each citizen of Russia equal part of property. Equal part of property. So let's distribute all property, almost all property, among all people in equal amounts. Of course, it's impossible. It's impossible to do so, and it is illegal. But it's interesting that almost nobody at that time recollects the principle of restitution of property, which turned to be norm all around east part of Europe, from Estonia to Bulgaria and even to Albania. And of course in Czech Republic. Restitution of property in Czech Republic is in some way best example of European Commission supposed Estonia and Czech Republic the best examples of decommunization in the post-communist Europe. It's necessary to understand. So democracy is impossible in Russia because of this inequality in property. And that's why from the presidential elections of 1996, the only one presidential elections in independent Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which Yeltsin took part. In these presidential elections, we saw a lot of mystifications, a lot of some illegal practice, and of course these elections were neither democratic nor free of falsifications. And after these elections, we may say that democracy is over, is finished in Russia. It's necessary to understand this fact. The main idea is that without legal, not equal, but without legal distribution of property and restitution of property rights after the rule of gang, it's a normal thing. For example, if some robbers took your property, when these robbers were arrested, this property ought to return to you. And it would be very strange if somebody very quick took this property and said, no, now it's mine. It's not yours. It was yours, but now it's mine. It will be strange. But in Russia, it occurred so. Absolutely. And the problem is that almost nobody recollect the real ownership. It is a result of communist propaganda and communist repressions during 7 decades. The second item, very close to the first one, is that these new owners of property were not simply active people. They were people who were close to former political establishment, mainly to KGB, to Communist Party leaders, or some group of them was simple criminal robbers. For example, main leaders of today's Russia, around Putin, it's, for example, General Patrushev, General Boltnikov, General Serge Ivanov. All of them, they were millionaires now. But all of them were generals of KGB before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now well-known political radical close to Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was simple criminal person. Simple criminal person. When he was 18 years old, in 1979, he was under court, and he was accused to 12 years of prison because of some very serious criminal deeds. And he was liberated only in 1990. So from 18 up till 30, he spent time in prison. And then he returned to be a businessman, very active one, and now he's the closest man to Mr. Putin. So you see this group of people, almost all of them were among party or KGB leaders. So it's not difficult to understand that this gang continue to control all property, all resources of Russia, even after 1991. Nothing changed in the possession of property. They imitate private ownership, but practically they continue to control all property of Russia with a poor and propertyless population of the country. Before revolution, before communist revolution, almost 90% 87, 88% of people in Russia were the possessors of property who gave them income. The percent of people who possess private property in Russia was higher than in all other countries of Europe, because the majority of peasants, after the reforms of 1861, had their private land. And now we see 1-2% of people who possess property. The second item, as I have already told, that this 1-2% was in majority the offspring of former communist and KGB elite. In each country, who want to take off communist past, the second step after institution of property is lustration. So the people who took part in the communist regime, who were members of this gang, to say in simple words, ought to be or under the court if they made personal crimes, or they ought to be out of political activity because they were members of this illegal and criminal gang in the past. Something like this, very softly, was done in majority of the countries of Eastern Europe. Nothing like this was done in Russia and in all other not Baltic republics of the former Soviet Union. Not only in Russia, but also in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, former communist and KGB leaders, or Komsomol leaders, Young Communist League, turned to be politicians, businessmen, and the new elite. No lustration was done. These two moments, this restitution of property and no lustration, formed a newly passed regime. It looks like absolutely new. Democratic, market regime, freedoms on the first glance. But if we look more thoroughly to the system, we see that old people, I mean old who were the people of the previous regime, in elite, or their offspring, they continue to possess all property. So nothing changed. That's why we didn't see real democracy, neither in Russia nor in other countries of the former Soviet Union, even in Ukraine at that time. There were some details. For example, Armenia and Ukraine were oligarch-ruled states, and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Belarus were monarchic states, authoritarian states with one leader. But it was only details. The main principle was the same. The previous elite continue to rule country. Maybe not only personally, because there were some peoples from not the highest echelons of elite, but in the same way. People, simple people, didn't return to politics, because without possession of property, it's impossible to return in politics on the other way than revolution. Only in revolution people without property can return to politics. In a normal democratic state, you ought to have something. You ought to have to own something, to be a citizen, a real citizen. This is the difference between, for example, Russian Revolution and French Revolution. You know that in France, up till now, all politicians speak about republican values, liberté, égalité, fraternité. But the reason of this ought to be clear to you, that during the revolution, in these terrible years of 1791, 1794, when it was Jacobin terror, at the same time, all land of landlords was given as private ownership to tenants. All land. And continue to be in the hands of these simple peasants up till now, if they not sold it. And when restoration occurred in 1815 in France, in 1815, the former landlords, King Louis XVIII paid million of golden francs to former landlords, but land continued to be in the hands of peasants. That's why in France these values of republic continue to be very strong up till now. Nothing like this in revolution, where Bolsheviks confiscated all land, and there were no private ownership at all. So we see this very terrible situation when former gangster elite continue to be in power, using democracy, market economy, all civic rights, only as semi-mystification, semi-shelter for their real activity. And they continue to live just as they lived in the communist period, but much more openly, because the Western world accepted this principle. The Western world agreed to see former KGB generals to be rulers of, or party nomenclature leaders, as Mr. Yeltsin himself, who was a member of Central Commission of Communist Party. Western world agreed to accept them as democratic leaders of new Russia, new Kazakhstan, new Belarus, new Ukraine, and prefer not to see this difference between Belarus and Czech Republic, Kazakhstan and, for example, Romania, in the plot of the system. In Russia and in Belarus, all the new elite was so sure in its strengths that it even not to change the symbolical level of former state. Who was the main criminal person, the head of the gang in the beginning of the communist regime? Who seized power? Mr. Lenin. And the monuments of Lenin continue to be in each town, in each maybe even village of Russia and Belarus. In Kazakhstan, for example, or Uzbekistan, these monuments were changed to some national leaders of Middle Age. Something changed. But in Russia, even this didn't occur. So the main robbers continue to be the symbols of the state. And Dzerzhinsky, for example, as it was a leader of KGB, NKVD, ЧК at that time, he continued to be the symbol of KGB up till now. And in each building of KGB, in each town, you may see these monuments and portraits of Mr. Dzerzhinsky, who was a terrible, cruel, bloody person. So even symbolical level continue. Names of the streets, names of the cities, something in the first years when it was not clear what way will follow Russia, and even the court legal process against Communist Party occurred in Russia in 1992, 1993, but it finished in nothing. Something was changed. For example, city Leningrad returned its name St. Petersburg. But region continued to be named Leningradsky, not Petersburgsky. The same situation in Ural region, where the main city of Ural, in communist period, Sverdlovsk, because Yakov Sverdlov is also one of these terrible communist leaders. Sverdlovsk was returned his previous name, Yekaterinburg. But the region of Yekaterinburg continued to be Sverdlovskaya Oblast up till now. And many regions, for example, many cities, for example, Simbirsk, continued to be named Ulyanovsk, and you remember that Ulyanov is the real second name of Lenin. Ulyanovsk continued to be the city and the region on Volga, up till now. And many, many other names. So even in symbolical way, everything preserved. When Putin came to power, he even strengthened this symbolical unity with criminal communist past. He immediately returned communist Bolsheviks' anthem, which was rejected during Yeltsin time, and erected this memory desk on KGB with Mr. Andropov, who was the leader of KGB and very cruel person, who prosecuted many people who had anti-communist ideas. And this criminal medical criminal medicine also was very widely used by Mr. Andropov. But he returned his memory desk to the building of KGB. And step by step, we see up till now the almost total reconstruction of that communist past. From day to day now, we are waiting that even the city of Tsaritsyn, who is now named Volgograd, will return its communist name Stalingrad. It's necessary to understand that nothing like communism as ideology never was in Russia during the Bolsheviks' time, and never was and will return to Russia now or in future. It was only the symbols of this criminal gang. Nothing more and nothing less. So it's necessary also to say about some other moments of this political regime. For example, after the end of Bolshevik regime, after the collapse of the USSR, no one law of pre-communist Russia returned as actual to Russian legal codes. No one law. And we had a very great amount of laws in pre-communist Russia. But all laws of communist period continued to be active up till the moment when some new law is accepted on the place of the previous one. So all these laws about confiscation of property continue to be reality up till now. And all the laws of pre-revolutionary Russia in which they spoke about this private property as something holy thing are not in use at all. Though in Constitution we had this idea that all laws which are not against this Constitution, which were used in the past in Russia, continue to be active. But in practice, nothing like this occurred. So in legal, in personal, in ideological form, we see that this principle of gang possessing, criminal gang possessing Russia, and other, for example, now we have elections in Kazakhstan with the same result, you see. Though person changed, but system is not changed in Kazakhstan. So this criminal gang continue to be in rule, going to continue ruling all our post-communist states of the former Soviet Union. And that's why it's nothing impossible, it's not surprising, that in one day the most strong country among the successors of the Bolsheviks gang, I mean Russian Federation, start again this aggressive politics, military aggressive politics against its neighbors. As you remember, in the previous lectures, we spoke about this idea of aggression of a worldwide communist state as the main and real idea of this gang. The main idea of this gang was not prosperity of people, equality of rights, democracy, nothing like this. The only idea was increasing the state, to capture new states, new lands. You remember this Second World War period, Second World War. Czechoslovakia itself turned to be a part of this and a victim of this aggression after the Second World War and again in 1968. This mood, this idea of aggression is not in the brains of Russian people. It's in the brains of this gangster elite. And Russian people, as all people all over the world, if they are in the hands of tyrants, if they are in the hands of these illegal and aggressive regimes, they are under the very strong propaganda. And that's why they follow these false ideas. One of the main ideas of propaganda is that the glory of Russia is something which ought to compensate all poorness of real life. Many people in Russia continue to live in very poor condition, as during the communist regime, during the communist regime, continue to live in the poor condition, but they want to see strong Russia. But this strong and great Russia is the goal not of these simple people. They turn to be fooled by propaganda. But the goal of this, not post-communist elite, but of this gangster gang, which continue to rule Russia. And that's why they start war against Ukraine in 2014, then in this year, on the 24th of February. And a war in Syria also, etc. So now, we ought to say that Mr. Putin, as remember that Ms. Merkel in 2014 said that Mr. Putin lost the connection with reality. It's really so. But he never lost the connection with the previous periods of communist, of Bolsheviks past. Mr. Putin itself was lieutenant colonel of KGB before 1991. And he continued to think in this communist elite, KGB elite manner up till now. And now we see that this terrible war continued for 9 months. A lot of people died. A lot of people lost their place of life in Ukraine. And even now we may say that more than 1 million of Russian people ought to leave country because they didn't accept this idea of aggression. Though maybe majority of them can't understand why this aggression took place, and just as simple Ukrainian people, they continue to say, for what he did so? But now you know the answer. For these principles of criminal gang, criminal mafia, which ruled Russia from 1917, he did so now when he saw that Mr. Putin, has enough strength to start the aggression. Thank to God, he made a great mistake. And now I think this war is not successful for him, but unsuccessful. And now we see the situation. Now with this situation, when decline of Putin's regime may be in the nearest future because of unsuccessfulness of this war with Ukraine. But what will be in future? It is a question which is not only scholar one. It is necessary to have this fundament of knowledge to understand the answers and to search for answers. But the question itself is a political one, not historical. In the nearest future, when the liberation of Ukraine turned to be the existing fact, some attempt to organize negotiations with Moscow, both from Kiev and from Europe, turned to be necessary, turned to be important. Is it possible to have negotiations with gangster regime? It's a question. I am sure that no, it's impossible. It's impossible. We need the change in the system of regime, not in persons. If Mr. Putin will be changed to Mr. Patrushev or Mr. Yevgeny, forgot his name, this criminal person, Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, nothing will change. If even not Putin, but some more, not liberal, of course, but not so terrible in his deeds person will be as the head of the state, but with the same ideas of continuation of this system of 100 years gang regime, nothing will change. We ought not to follow imitations. We ought not to follow the not to accept these false things as pseudo-democracy, pseudo-market, pseudo-liberal attitude to international affairs, nothing like this. If we want, and when I say we, I mean both normal Russian people who want to finish once and forever with this gang, and I mean all European people and all people of the democratic world, from Japan to the United States, what we ought to understand. Not to do, but to understand. The first principle is we ought to understand with absolute clearness the nature of Russian political regime. Now you know what it is. And second one, we ought to understand that no agreements with this regime before lustrations will take part. Lustration is an in-home problem of Russia. But now, since Russia turned to be an aggressive state, and you know that today European Parliament accepts declaration that Russia is a supporter of terrorism. Now the problem of lustration to be an international problem for Russia. Other countries ought to say without lustration, and you remember that lustration in Latin is clearness. Clearness. It is washing off all bad things. Am I right? Yes. So without this lustration of political regime, and serious lustration, not formal, no conversation, no negotiations, no contacts. Not Russian people who are under propaganda in Russia, but international community ought to say without illustration, no negotiations. People with whom Western society may agree to have negotiations ought to be people who are not the members of this gang. Both communist gang, since Patrushev, Boltnikov, all communist KGB generals, or gang of Putin, for example, Mr. Prigozhin. The third one, new Russian regime with which European democratic world is ready to start conversation, ought to be free from KGB Putin collaborators. The fourth principle, democracy in Russia ought to be a condition sine qua non. Because without real democracy, not imitation of democracy, and you remember that imitation of democracy was in Russia from Lenin's times up till now. And only a very small period of time during Gorbachev regime, there was real elections. Because Yeltsin won, democratically won only one elections in June 1991, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's necessary to remember. So real democracy. Without real democracy, Russia is not a country with which we at democratic world, is ready to have conversations, to have some negotiations. Only if Russia turned to be a really democratic country, it's possible to remove sanctions and to take again into world's community Russia as country. But then we also ought to understand that democracy in post-communist countries, it's different between post-communist and post-Nazi countries. Because during Nazi period there was not confiscation of all property. It's necessary to understand it. So the problem of restitution of property never was the problem when we spoke about denazification. But when we speak about post-communist states, and in former Soviet Union, except Baltic, up till now, restitution of property ought to be the absolutely necessary principle. Without restitution of property, no democracy. Without democracy, no negotiations, no reliable Russia, no future in this Euro-Asian part of the world. So, restitution of property is absolutely necessary. And not only this. When, up till all these Bolshevik leaders who were the terrible murderers and robbers, continue to be as monuments and as names all over Russia and Belarus, it's impossible to have negotiations with Russia. Now, the Western world ought to understand that it is not only inner problem of Russia. Who is symbols of this country? If symbols of the country are absolutely awful people, it's easy to understand that the politics of this country also will be absolutely awful. If, for example, now in Germany, in each city we'll see Hitler's statue, no one country, normal country, democratic country, will be in normal, positive relations with Germany. It's easy to understand. And the same situation ought to be in Russia. So after the end of this war, when Russia will try to re-establish normal relations with the world ought to answer, we don't believe you, because Lenin is, his physical corpse are in the center of Russia in Red Square. His monuments and monuments of Dzerzhinsky, Kiev, Sverdlov, etc., are all over Russia. We don't believe in you. We are sure that you are successors of these awful people. If we not change, we'll not change our attitude to you. So the change of cultural paradigm from Lenin and Dzerzhinsky to the real victims or real fighters with Bolshevik regime, or real reformers of Russia in pre-revolutionary times, is necessary item, is not something faculty, it's necessary. It is also a central item. And for example, among these fighters with communist regime, of course, Czech and Slovak legionnaires also ought to take its place as positive persons who struggled with this terrible regime, though at that time in vain. Then demilitarization of Russia. All these symbolical and political reforms, such as democratization, are very good, and deputinization. But it is impossible to believe that Russian great strengths, nuclear strengths, will not be used again if some people who are close to the past, this gangster past, return to power. You remember very well that in Nazi Germany and post-Nazi Germany, after the Second World War, only in 10 years, in 11 years, Bundeswehr was allowed as an independent military force. And even after this time, after 1956, it continued to be under NATO control. Maybe only after 1991, the German army turned to be totally independent in their inner problems. It is a real thing. And it's something like this ought to be done for Russia if Russia want to continue and want to return to international relations. It's necessary also to say about decartelization, because now these semi-private, I say fails private corporations as Rosneft, Gazprom, North Metal, etc., they are absolutely artificial and practically under government supervise. And it's necessary to make real many independent economical entrepreneurships in all these fields, in gas, in oil, in metals, in forests, I don't know, I'm not an economist, but this decartelization is absolutely necessary thing. And in Nazi Germany, after Nazi regime, decartelization was one of the principles of returning Germany to European community. And maybe the last problem is counter-propaganda. World ought to say Russia. If you allow some people to continue to declare the ideas of re-establishment of an empire, glorification of these communist leaders, negating the terrible repressions which took part during this Bolshevik period, we cannot re-establish relations with you. You continue to be a gangster force. Maybe it was good to do so in 1992, in the end of 1991, but nobody on the West think about it. Nobody. And we see that in 3 decades, in 30 years, the results of this neglecting of inner change of Russia from gangster state to normal state resulted in the terrible war in Europe. Russia will continue to be, in one way or another. Almost 120 million people who speak in Russian language, use Russian language as native, continue to be. But the problem of all the world, and especially of Europe, and democratic part of Asia, Far East, is what to do with Russia. Try to change it to democratic, normal state as Germany, West Germany was changed after the Second World War, or to put it as it is. You remember very well that when, after Versailles treatment, the borders of Germany was changed, colonies were taken from it, but Germany continued, were allowed to be what it liked. In 15 years, Hitler came to power. For us, for both of us, Europeans and Russians, who have, like me, democratic ideals, it's impossible to continue this mistake of Versailles. We ought to change Russia. And it is our effort, both of you and me, and of all people of the world who want to live in peace. Now it's necessary to change Russia to normal state. And without understanding of its past, we cannot design its future. That's why, my dear friends and colleagues, history is not a scholar discipline only, but some very necessary thing for future life of the people. Thank you. Dear Professor Farms, I tried to stop in time. So now questions? Yeah.
Hi. I would like to ask whether you see Russia as a democratic country for let's say in 20 years, and if it's possible. Sorry?
Or in the past?
In the future. In the future. And if it's even possible, when the support for the Russian population, mostly outside of the cities, is inclining towards the not democratic regimes, but communist regime, for example. And I'm a bit afraid it always will, because there is a big support there was no democracy in Russia ever.
You see, you are not absolutely right when you say never. Never say never, you know. In Russia, there was a rather large period of semi-democratic regime before revolution. From the great reforms of 1864, I mean this self-government reform, up till the end of temporary government in 1917. We had democratic institutions, we had parliament, self-government, and this experience of democracy many Russian people had. Multi-party system, for example, after 1905. And it's interesting that Bolsheviks immediately forbade all this democratic self-government. I mean, земство in Russian, земство. Immediately, on the 1st of January, 1918. So we had this experience. Rather, this experience was more than 100 years ago. But now we have, and in 1991, when this formal communist regime collapsed, all the Russian people had no experience of democracy, of pluralistic world, had some, I mean, semi-folklore ideas about it. And that's why it was easy to misguide them and to re-establish this gangster regime in Russia. But now many Russian people live abroad. Even in Russia, we had some period of independent education, and a lot of our colleagues from abroad came to Russia, deliver lectures. I suppose that new generation of Russian people are much closer to the ideas of democracy than in 1991. Much more close. And when this million of people who now emigrate from the war abroad will return to Russia, it strengthens the group of democratically minded people. And besides all this, as you remember, I said that these ideas of imperialism, just as ideas of Nazism in Germany after Second World War, ought to be restricted formally by law. That's why I think that not in 2 decades, not in 20 years, but in much less period of time, we'll see democracy in Russia. But it's necessary to remember this also economical and property base for democracy. It's of course not easy process, but it ought to be done hand by hand, all the things.
I would like to ask you about, and it was about this question also, what is importance of legacy also in the Russian history?
Legacy.
Legacy.
Oh.
Because I think it is very interesting thinking about it, because when you have some revolution, some people think the changes are now, everything is done and everything is over. but also in our country, in Czech Republic, there are many debates. Now we are going to have presidential elections and people debating about some politicians who want to be presidents, about their past maybe communistic part. There was also discussion in the 60s, 70s in West Germany. There was many protests about Nazi legacy. What is the part of the legacy? What is how to deal with it? How to say we can start all over again, or is it possible to say now we can start all over again in some point?
It's a very good question. Russia is a historical state with a great past of 1,000 years. And of course, this legacy cannot be removed. And for me as a historian, it's absolutely clear that legacy help us, our legacy, a legacy of each country, help us to construct a future. But the problem is our attitude to our legacy, our attitude to our past. You remember that, for example, just in the beginning, and maybe in the middle of the 20th century, the idea that your history of each country, for their citizens, for its citizens, is something sacral thing, was a normative idea. No critics of your past. It's unpatriotic, maybe. Now you see that in all democratic countries, their attitude to the past is much more critically accepted. In the United States, in Great Britain, British Empire, this slavery attitude to native population of America, etc., in the United States, in each country. Even in small countries such as Finland, for example, democratic one, also people began to say that between wars, attitude of the Finnish majority to Swedish minority was not right, was not good, and it is one of the problems of our country, etc. I think that it's a very important thing that we ought to prepare in Russia. If each nation ought to think about their home problems, we ought to prepare critical attitude to all Russian history. Not negative. We have also positive things, of course, in the past. But it ought to be not permissive for everything. It ought to be a really critical attitude. And moral attitude ought to predominate. Good things. And what is good things? Good things is not good for nation. Good things is good for person. We ought to return to the beginning of our lectures, to the first lecture, when I said that after the Second World War, the great shift occurred in the consciousness of Europe, Western Europe. Then it come, maybe not totally to eastern part of Europe. It is a shift from national-oriented or group-oriented politics to personal-oriented politics. So this personalism turned to be the main philosophy of post-war Europe, personalism. And if we think about history, we ought to think on the thing, what is good for person, for simple person, for peasant, for soldier, for some worker, and of course for high classes also, but in personal level. And this is the simple key to the history, the life of a man, not the life of a nation. If we speak about nation, we speak about increasing of territory, strengthening of the state, but the problem of person is the key for modern history. I think it's a real key to history.
Next.
Good evening, Professor. I would like to ask you if the regime will fall, the old Russian regime.
You mean old Russia? It's pre-revolutionary.
No. I mean the current one. Like, if it will fall, how can Russian people ever trust anyone again after so many years of these regimes? And how can they trust the East, the West, because they have been lied to for so many years that everyone around them is against them. And now they will learn that even inside there were people who were oppressing them. How can a healthy society without trust, trust, rise?
I see, yes. It's a good question. To make a long story short, if you in the West see really systematic reorganization of state and society, systematic reforms, you may trust. If you see only imitation of reforms, it's necessary not to trust to Russia. And that's why all my lectures are the lectures about reforms, great reforms of 19th century, and necessary reforms of today. So systematic reforms, and these systematic reforms, for example, in post-Nazi Germany, turned Germany to be a normal and even positive European country. But we never ought to forget that during these 12 years of Nazi regimes, the grandfathers of today's and grandmothers of today's German people took part in Holocaust and in other terrible things. But it's possible to change everything. People is changeable material. We ought to change it in the right direction. It's our mission. It's the mission of you, university students, of educated people, to help simple people to understand what is good and what is bad. And, for example, Hitler did vice versa. He named good things bad and bad things good, just as Lenin, for example. And now we ought to recover from this illness.
Thank you very much for your lectures, Mr. Professor. I'm just a visitor, but I enjoyed it very much and it gave me a lot. I would like to ask you if you intend to formulate your thesis about how to change Russia in written form and, for example, send it to European Parliament or somewhere.
Yes, of course, I think that lecture is some event. And now this lecture is recorded, so many people can follow it. And though my English is poor, they can understand it. And not only Russian-speaking people, they will be able to understand it. Of course, I will write my thesis, because this course, thank you for this question, this course of 6 lectures, was not something normative for me. For the first time, I recollect and rethink many my ideas when I prepared these lectures. And I understood some things much better than I understood it before this course. That's why it's necessary, of course, to write down and to prepare something. But it's also necessary to do so for political reasons, because each day some political contacts may start between Russia and Ukraine and allied countries of Europe, of NATO, and it's necessary to make clear the real situation, not to do mistakes again.
Thank you. There is a question that worries me quite a bit. Several times you mentioned the comparison with the Nazi Germany and how it was able to turn into a democratic country pretty quickly. But I can't help myself from feeling that pretty important part was missed, being the fact that the Nazi Germany regime was militarily defeated. It was pretty much destroyed, and in the following decades, Germany didn't really have any other possibility than to change into a democratic country. Yes. And right now, I can't stop questioning myself whether the possible future defeat of Russia, or Putin rather, in Ukraine will have a big enough impact to start the changes in Russia, or if anything more is necessary.
I understand your question. It's a really very serious question. Very serious question. Of course, it's difficult to imagine that Russia will be defeated just as Germany in the Second World War, so that the whole territory of Russia will be occupied by, I don't know, Ukrainian NATO forces. Sure enough, the best solution now which we can imagine is the liberation of Ukraine, but Russia continues to be under its own government. But this is a real problem, because we have examples of these military defeated but preserved states. For example, Iran, or communist Russia after the Polish War in 1920. But I think that today's Russian elite is interested in establishing relations with the world. And the main problem is not to allow to re-establish these elections without systematic and deep change in Russian regime. So what was done by occupational administration in Germany after the Second World War ought to be done without this occupation by the countries which supported Ukraine, which support Ukraine in this war. It is a real task. It is a really difficult task. But I hope that it can be successful. I hope so. We'll see what will be in future.
Good evening, Professor. I've just had a question. With which degree of superstition did the Russian people accept the change between pre-1991 Russia and post-1991 Russia? And can this change of mentality somehow mirror our expectations to how the Russian mentality might theoretically change in the future should the Putin regime fall?
It's a good question, because almost all Russian people, except me, and maybe some of my colleagues and co-thinkers, suppose that there is a great difference between formal communist regime before 1991 and regime after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that one of my inventions is that I see that there is no dramatic difference between these two regimes. And this understanding gives us a key for future. Now I try to explain this idea to people, in some seminars, in my writings. It's necessary to understand. But the majority of people continue to think that before, some people think that before, during the communist regime, it was a terrible life, and now it turned to be better. Some people, and majority, think that during the communist period it was better life, and now it turned to be worse. And there is difference. But both groups suppose that there is some principal difference between these two periods. The keys, and you are my experimental auditory, the key is that there is no difference. No difference.
So our time is fulfilled, but
the last question.
To compare Ukrainians and Russians, they just were in one period. They go through many same conditions, but Ukrainians are fighting. I don't know how to say, but Ukrainians.
Yes.
Ukrainians have more protest, and why does it happen?
I understand your main idea of your question, and I try to answer. It's an interesting question. Yes, really so. In Ukraine, we have two realities. One reality is that the largest part of Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, of this gang ruled state, just from the beginning, from civil war of 1920. And the mentality of these people is very close to the mentality of Russian people. But in Ukraine, you have different part. I mean Western Ukraine, which was occupied by communist regime practically only after Second World War. It was occupied formally in September 1939, but practically after Second World War. And this western part of Ukraine, in all behavioral forms, very close to Baltic states, to Moldavia, and to western part of Belarus. Because a regime was not so cruel after, it was cruel of course, but not so cruel after Second World War. The most dramatical period is the period of this collectivization and great terror of 30s. And the parts of Ukraine who were independent from communist regime during these periods, they preserved much more personal identification and strength and inner mood. And I think that these events in, for example, in 2013, 2014, and before it, Orange Revolution, when Yushchenko was elected, was made en masse by the help of this western part of Ukraine. Though, of course, Kiev intelligentsia also took part in it, it's understandable. But even the simple people, simple peasants of western part of Ukraine, they made this process much more dynamic than, for example, in Russia. But in Russia, we see also great demonstrations during the Gorbachev time, during the beginning of Yeltsin regime. So Russian population also was active. But then it was crashed by this difficult life under these unequal conditions. Of course, there are differences, but the main principles are the same. I remember one Ukrainian colleague, very good person, said that it was before 2014, it was in the autumn 2013, when we met in Italy on one conference. He told me, do you know the difference between Russia and Ukraine? I said, of course I know many differences, but I understand that you want to say me something new. Yes, you see, in Russia, KGB rules bandits, but in Ukraine, bandits rules KGB. There is a main difference. So, dear friends, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Andrej.